Welcome to the Enlightenment Podcast, to our listeners and viewers around the world. Here we dive into meaningful dialogue about Palestine, offering some insight and context that is woefully missing from mainstream legacy media, while also celebrating a lot of Palestine's rich traditions, culture, and heritage. For over a century, we've all been told that Britain lawfully governed Palestine, that the League of Nations mandated Britain to create a Jewish homeland, and that the international community supported these actions. Professor John Quigley has spent 40 years in legal archives uncovering the truth. And his assertion is that every single one of these claims is a lie. And now Professor Quigley is using that evidence to demand that the UK government admit to what it did. Today, we're very excited to be joined by Professor John Quigley, Professor Emeritus of International Law at Ohio State University. He's written many books, and his latest, Britain and its Mandate over Palestine, Legal Chicanery on a World Stage, exposes the fraud and the foundation for everything that we're witnessing today. My first question to Hanan: how did Professor Quigley come to our attention, Hanan?
Well, it's through my cousin, Dr. Victor Kattan, and also Professor Avi Shleim over lunch at his lovely house. And they both worked with Professor Quigley, and I highly recommend the podcasts we did with both of them in case you've missed them. So, Professor Quigley, ahlan, welcome to the Enlightenment Podcast.
Thank you very much.
Lovely to have you. And we'll dive right in if we may. So most lawyers study what happened in Palestine usually after the Nakba, after 1948. But you went even further back to the very beginning. So we'd love to know, what was your interest in Palestine? And if you can take us back to when you realized everything you've been told about Britain's role in Palestine was a lie. And also, what made you start questioning this sort of narrative, if you like?
Well, it's hard to deal with the legal issues relating to Palestine without going back earlier than the time of the Second World War and the formation of the United Nations. One finds, for example, reference in the Israeli Declaration of Statehood of 1948 to the period of the 1920s and what was done at that time.
And what made you, so I was interested in this, I'm a novelist and a filmmaker, and you get these moments which seem very dramatic, I don't know, in my world, but can you take us into one of those moments? Because I understand that you discovered that there were some documents that did not match the official narrative, which was the standard story after World War I, was that the League of Nations gave Britain this mandate to govern Palestine. Was that not what happened? And how do you know that? What were the documents that made that clear to you?
Well, there are a number of documents. One was a transcript of a statement by Britain's principal legal advisor, a man named Cecil Hurst, who was representing Britain in the Permanent Court of International Justice in a case brought by Greece against Britain in 1924 relating to Palestine and to concessions that had been given to a Greek entrepreneur by the Turkish government prior to the First World War. And in the course of that proceeding, the British lawyer, Cecil Hurst, gave a bit of an analysis of Britain's status in Palestine. And he said that the peace treaty with Turkey, which had just been signed at that time, didn't give Britain anything. And one prerequisite for a mandate was at the time to have territorial title. That is, the First World War ended, and some areas were being taken over by the Allies from Germany and others from Turkey. But the idea was that those Allied countries would gain title through a peace treaty. And with regard to Germany, that was done in the Treaty of Versailles, where Germany explicitly renounces in favor of the Allies. The British government was hoping to get a similar statement in a peace treaty with Turkey, but it was unsuccessful in doing that. Turkey refused. This was a time when Kemal Atatürk was coming to power in Turkey. There was a resurgence of Turkey's nationalism, you might say. So the peace treaty that was actually signed, which was 1923, the Treaty of Lausanne, gave Britain nothing. In the statement that he made before the Permanent Court of International Justice, the British lawyer Hearst said precisely that. He said the Treaty of Peace gives Britain nothing. And that was contrary to the official British position, which was that the Treaty of Peace accepted the idea of a mandate, which it did not. I mean, so the British lawyer was contradicting what the government was saying at the political level. So that was something of an aha moment when I saw that. And then, of course, the Treaty of Lausanne itself, that got me to read that treaty more carefully than I had before. And I saw that Hearst was correct, that the treaty didn't say that Britain would have a mandate. In that sent me back to the drafting history of the Treaty of Lausanne, and I saw that Britain had tried to get Turkey to write in a provision where Turkey would recognize that Palestine was under a mandate, and Turkey declined to do that. So that was another important documentary source. And then there was another, I'm sorry, but there are a number of critical documents. In 1923, the British government went to the Council of the League of Nations and asked the League Council to make a statement that the claimed mandate would be legally effective at the time that the Treaty of Lausanne would enter into force. And the League of Nations declined to do that. So there's really nothing in the documentary history that supports the proposition that Britain actually had a mandate over Palestine, or that it had any territorial right that would allow it even to be there following the Treaty of Lausanne.
Very interesting. And I believe it got explosive when you uncovered the British government document that was sitting in plain sight for, I think, 100 years or so, and where Britain admitted it had no legal basis except for the military conquest. So how did that discovery come through, and how was it missed for a century until you sort of found it? And can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, that's quite odd. It's right there in the documentation of the Permanent Court of International Justice, and I think no one had bothered to read it for 100 years. That's the simple explanation. I think Britain had been quite successful in getting its narrative to be believed. So most of the writing by even Palestinian historians on this accepted the British narrative, and it became the gospel truth, you might say, and it wasn't being challenged. I mean, I have to admit that in some of my early writings, I accepted it as well. That is, before I went and looked at the actual documents.
That's amazing. It's amazing that it's always hidden in plain sight, but no one bothered really.
Yeah. I mean, it's really important in historical analysis to go to documentation, and it constantly surprises me that people write history based on what some other historian has said about a situation, but without going into the actual documents of the period.
Professor Quigley, can we talk about the Balfour Declaration? This was the November 1917 letter that promised a Jewish national home in Palestine. Most people think it was an official international agreement, but can you just explain a little bit about what the Balfour Declaration is, and why did Britain issue it? And does it have any legal standing whatsoever?
Well, in terms of what it was, it's a very odd document. It was a statement made by the War Cabinet in 1917 saying that Britain accepted the idea that there would be a Jewish national home in Palestine, again, without explaining that term or what it meant or whether it had anything to do with having territory in Palestine as opposed to some kind of cultural center where Jews could perhaps migrate to Palestine and have control over their own communities, which was something that was quite common at that point in history, that different communities, like the Greeks in Albania would have their own schools and churches. So there was ambiguity as to what was meant by the concept. But the document itself then was never actually issued by the British government. You would expect a statement of policy to be issued as a command paper, would be the normal way at that point in history. And it wasn't done. Instead, the cabinet asked A.J. Balfour, who had been involved in the drafting of the document for the War Cabinet, asked him to deliver it to the British Zionist Federation. And that's what Balfour did. Balfour actually was not a member of the War Cabinet, so Balfour is not the issuer of the document. That's why the fact that it is referred to as the Balfour Declaration has always surprised me, and that's a bit inaccurate. It should be called the War Cabinet Declaration. Calling it Balfour Declaration, given that he was the Secretary for Foreign Affairs, that implies that it was a kind of British policy, whereas when you see that it was actually done by the War Cabinet, you understand that it was done to help Britain win the war, and that it didn't have any real significance beyond that. But it did say that Britain would use its best efforts to ensure the implementation, but it was unclear what that meant. At that point in time, Britain had no territorial control in Palestine. So in any event, if you look at the text, if you just Google Balfour Declaration, what you will see is a letter from Balfour to Lord Rothschild, who was a leading figure in the British Zionist Federation. So it's a letter from Balfour to Rothschild, in which Balfour recites the text of what had been decided by the War Cabinet. So it's a very odd document. It was not made public by the British government. It was a private letter to the head of the British Zionist Federation. And so it's a document whose character is very unclear because, as I say, it was never officially adopted, and then the wording of it is very ambiguous. But it does seem that the purpose was to solidify the support of the United States for sending troops to assist in the war, which was something that was very critical to the Allied side. And Woodrow Wilson, the US president, had been successfully lobbied by Louis Brandeis, who had been one of his financial backers in the 1912 presidential election. And then, of course, Woodrow Wilson had appointed Brandeis to the US Supreme Court. And Brandeis had a role actually in assessing some of the drafts of the document that was then decided upon by the War Cabinet. So it's all a rather confusing history. But to go back to your question, you do find an occasional Israeli scholar who will say that the Balfour Declaration was a legal document that had binding effect on the British government and binding effect on what would happen in Palestine. But most scholars, even most Israeli legal scholars, don't take that position at all. They refer rather to a notation that was made by the Council of the League in 1922, in which the Council said that it approved the text of the Balfour Declaration. That's in July of 1922. But that was not a document in which the Council purported to say that Britain would actually have a mandate. And the Council, in any event, did not have power under the Covenant of the League of Nations to say that a statement that a potential mandatory power would draft would or would not be lawful. And moreover, the document that Britain drafted, which is called the British Mandate for Palestine, was wildly inconsistent with the Covenant of the League of Nations. the covenant had required that the territories being separated from Turkey would be provisionally independent, that they would have self-determination. And the mandate document says nothing about that, but says rather that the British government would have full control over Palestine. And the covenant specifically says that the role of a mandatory in the territories being separated from Turkey would only provide what was called in the covenant administration and assistance. In other words, that there would be a local government that would be advised by, assisted by France or by Britain. But in this document that Britain wrote up that came to be called the British Mandate for Palestine, it says the British government will have full legislative control. I mean, that was completely at odds with what the covenant called for. And the covenant also said that before a mandatory power could be, could have, let's say, before a claimed mandatory power could actually have a mandate, the population of the territory had to be consulted, and that consultation would be a primary consideration before any state could have a mandate. And the British government clearly did not do that at all. In fact, it said at the time, we're not going to consult anyone. And the king didn't consult anyone. The mandate was actually declared by Britain in July of 1920 by the Crown in quite a unilateral fashion. So everything that was done by Britain was in violation of the covenant. So the argument made by scholars, by many scholars, that what was done through the League somehow legalized the Balfour Declaration and made it into an international instrument of some sort. None of that is valid.
So just so the audience and we are clear, so not only did Britain issue a propaganda letter, really, that's worthless through wartime with zero legal authority, but somehow this worthless piece of paper becomes the basis of the entire mandate. And even though it contradicted with the League and what it stood for, somehow it became known as, well, Britain managed to write it into what became known as the Mandate for Palestine. So how did Britain get away with it? How did they convince the world and the international community that this was endorsed? Because these are very grave lies and deceptions, if you like.
Yeah, no, you raise a very important question, and it's one that I've never been able to fully answer to my own satisfaction. As I said, in 1923, the British government went to the Council of the League. And again, the Council of the League has no power to say anything, no power to say you have a valid mandate. But if I'll assume for the moment that the League did have such a power, even if it did, Britain was going to the Council and saying, once the Treaty of Lausanne goes into effect, can you, the Council, say that Britain has a mandate over Palestine? And the League Council never said that. What had happened was that back in 1922, when the Council had issued its statement approving the text of the mandate document, it had tied the British mandate to France's mandate over Syria, because France wasn't willing to go along as a member of the council with having the council say that Britain had a mandate before the council would say that France had a mandate. There was contention between France and Britain on this. So the British government went to the council and asked that it should say that once the Treaty of Lausanne went into effect, that Britain had a mandate. And there was a problem with that, of course, that the Treaty of Lausanne didn't give Britain anything. But just at that point in time, the French government approached the council and said, we now have a valid mandate document for Syria, because France and Italy were arguing about the mandate document for Syria. And what the council did at that point was to say, well, now that has been worked out by France, the mandate for Britain and the mandate for Syria would enter into effect at the same time. But still, the British government, at the time that it was approaching the council, was saying, of course, we need to have territorial rights from Turkey, and those never came about. So what the council said, this is now September of 1923, it said the two would enter into effect at the same time, but it didn't say the British mandate is entering into effect as of here and now. And again, the council had no role under the covenant to be saying that in any event.
It's quite amazing that they just kind of asked for it and got away with it.
Perhaps I should add that after that point in time, the British government began saying, well, we do have a valid mandate, even though the council hadn't said that. And the British government got away with that. I mean, the council never, tried to countermand Britain's public position then on the matter. But in the discussion among the Allies, this was now April of 1920 at a meeting they held in San Remo, Italy. At that meeting, Britain was badgering the others to get them to agree to write the Balfour Declaration into the peace treaty with Turkey. And the others were saying, no, we won't support the Balfour Declaration if it means that it would override the national rights of the population of Palestine. Yeah. France was very clear on that. Japan was very clear on that as well. So that's another point that Britain makes, and that you will see many scholars making, that the major powers accepted the Balfour Declaration, and it's simply not justified by the historical evidence.
Interesting. So if France, Italy, Japan, maybe even the US, I'm not sure, I'm going to ask you, refused to recognize this legal status that Britain claimed, how did Britain get away with it? How did they continue this charade if nobody else was kind of on board?
Well, I think it's a matter of realpolitik that Britain was there, and I mean, for the League of Nations, had they said that what Britain is doing is illegal, it would have called into question the whole concept of mandates. I mean, you can ask, why would the council approve the document that Britain submitted that was wildly at odds with the covenant? And I think the answer is that the League regarded this mandate concept as the crown jewel of the covenant, that this showed that they were not being colonial anymore. But Britain was not going to change it. So they really had no choice but to go along with what Britain was suggesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, I guess it's kind of, we see that all over the place today as things are, the ICJ declares something legal, but it just keeps continuing. Some other legal scholars have raised different interpretations of what happened. I wanted to ask you about that. I'm thinking about Dr. Ralph Wild, who's argued that while the League Council did exceed its authority, Palestine still remained within the mandate system, which meant that Palestinians had rights to self-determination and that Britain was obligated to protect it. How do you respond to that interpretation? Does it change fundamental illegality of what Britain did?
Well, I think Britain did have an obligation to promote self-determination, but that flows from the covenant.
Right.
You don't need the mandate document for that. And if you look at the mandate document itself, there is nothing in the mandate document that talks about the welfare of the population or self-determination. The mandate document is entirely oriented towards saying that Britain will support the promotion of the Jewish national home, that there would be a Jewish organization that would assist in the administration of Palestine that came to be called the Jewish Agency, and further that other member states of the League would have commercial access to Palestine. So if you look at the text of the mandate document, there's nothing in it that says anything favorable to the population of Palestine. And it's remarkable that that all of this was realized at the time by lawyers in Palestine. That is, there were some very sophisticated legal scholars in Palestine at the time. The Turkish parliament had included representation from Palestine. You had a grouping of Palestinian politicians and lawyers who had participated in the Turkish parliament, where they decided, all issues related to the Turkish Empire. They were quite sophisticated. And when the king in 1920 came out with this proclamation saying that this document would be implemented in Palestine, they immediately responded and said, this is unlawful under the covenant of the League. So they were making the appropriate legal arguments, both to Britain and to the League of Nations.
And the sort of your discoveries continue, because you also discovered a secret British cabinet files in 1923, I think around 6 years after the Balfour Declaration, and where Britain said it would cause a disaster and it would destroy Palestine if they implemented the Balfour Declaration. And yet, can you tell us a bit about the background of your discovery and the conclusion of that secret committee and why it still matters?
This is another fascinating aspect of the whole picture. You had a change in government at that point, 1923 in Britain. the new government that came in decided to do a review of the policy of the British government in relation to Palestine. And really everything was on the table, including a complete withdrawal from Palestine. The cabinet, analyzed what had gone on, largely because there had been significant protests in Palestine. It was not only the lawyers and politicians that were writing these really good legal documents, but you had people protesting in the streets in Palestine against the idea that this Jewish agency group would be brought in to assist in the administration of the country. So by 1923, you already had a British government, the new one, that was questioning whether this was worth the candle. And their conclusion was that they really would not be able to maintain control in Palestine without significant military input, and that the situation as it was unfolding would continue to be quite bad, and that if they continued the way they were, they would have great difficulty controlling the country. So having concluded that, they then said, well, what should we do? And the answer was, well, we'll just keep doing what we're doing, and we'll hope for the best, but without having any real expectation that would come about. What they said was, we have our own interest for being in Palestine. We're losing control in Egypt, and that's on one side of the Suez Canal. So we need to have something on this side of the Suez Canal, and that's our passage to India through through the Suez Canal. And we did make, well, it was the previous government, but the previous government had made this ambiguous statement in the Balfour Declaration. They said, well, if we went back on it now we've gone, or the previous government has gone to the League and said, please approve the text of this document. And now we would be saying, well, we really shouldn't have asked you to do that. So it would have been very awkward for the British government to retract the mandate document. But at the same time, it didn't see any good outcome from what it was doing, but it said, we'll just continue. To my mind, it reads something like a Greek tragedy, where things are going to be bad and things just keep getting worse, and then the bad thing results. And that's what happened in Palestine.
Yeah. I mean, it's amazing. I see that it was so really the Suez, they had their international things. They got themselves into a situation where all hell was breaking loose. They certainly weren't in a position to protect the rights of the Palestinians while still trying to implement a Jewish homeland. But they couldn't find a way out.
Yeah. I mean, there could have been a way out. They could have construed the concept of Jewish national home in a limited fashion. And in fact, they were stating at the time that Jewish national home did not mean a territorial state. They said that this is the white paper issued by Churchill as colonial secretary in 1922. But on the ground, they were promoting the Jewish agency, and they were allowing it to come in. They were allowing the Jewish agency to take over the economy of the country. So on the ground, they were really promoting eventual territorial statehood, especially with the immigration, allowing immigration.
Yeah, and I think it was very much intentional. They didn't want to change. They actually wanted to push it and to set up their own settler colony outpost, with having more and more Zionists come in. Which brings me to my cousin Anne-Marie Jasser's new brilliant film. I don't know if you've seen it, Palestine 36. It's really a must-see film. And we did a wonderful podcast with her, which I highly recommend. And that leads me to actually what was happening in Palestine during the 20s and the 30s, because the British, knowing this is a failed and it's going to cause a disaster, they still implemented the policy. They actually ratcheted it up, if you like, with their sort of cracking down on Palestinians while training Zionist militias, while arming them. So can you talk about what was the Palestinian daily experience like in their villages, families, and the effect of this implementation of the mandate and what the British were doing?
Well, yes, by the mid-30s, the population was going beyond just street protests, and they started an armed rebellion against the British government. An action that I think in terms of law was quite lawful, because they were being unlawfully occupied by a state that had gotten nothing out of the peace treaty of Lausanne. So the British government then put that down in very harsh terms, and it committed acts that we would now characterize, and even could have been characterized at the time, as war crimes, or even crimes against humanity. That is, imposing curfews on villages, rounding up males of military age and arresting them on bogus kinds of charges, and of bringing the Zionist militias into that operation, and that is what is explained in this film that you're mentioning, the Palestine 36 film. That was a critical set of events for the people of Palestine, because the British government was able to put down that military uprising in such a way as to deprive the population of any military capacity. I mean, if you look at the other territories of Turkey at the time, Iraq and Syria, in both of them, you had military risings that succeeded to a certain degree in preventing either Britain in relation to Iraq and France in relation to Syria, prevented them from administering in the way they wanted to. And Iraq actually was able to gain its independence by the early 30s, and Syria by the early 1940s. But Palestine was not. It didn't have the military capacity once Britain had put it down and it sent leaders into exiles and many into prisons. And that weakened the Palestinian population to the point that when you get to 1947, it had very little capacity to oppose the expulsions that then were being carried out by the Zionist militia.
And then in 1947, everything comes to a head because Britain wants to get out. The United Nations sets up a special committee to decide what to do with Palestine. And you've shown how this committee was fed lies by both Britain and the Zionist organization. What were those lies? What was that disinformation, and how did that lead to the recommendation for partition?
Well, the UN Committee on Palestine accepted what had come to be Britain's narrative about its status in Palestine, namely that the mandate was an international legal document, that the League Council had, in effect, required Britain to promote Zionism in Palestine. And that narrative was accepted by the UN Committee on Palestine, largely because when that committee went to Jerusalem for hearings, the members were lobbied by the Jewish Agency, which had formal testimony before the committee, but also lobbied them informally and convinced them of the British narrative. And no one on the special committee bothered to look at any of the documents that we've been talking about. And the members of the committee were uniformly people who had very little background on Palestine and didn't really know what had gone on. They were only given a few weeks to come up with a report. So, you had a group of people knowing nothing about the situation being required to come up with a report within a few weeks. So it's understandable, I suppose, that they didn't look to see what had actually gone on and what had not gone on. More importantly, in the 1920s. And the British government was not being very forthcoming. The British government actually did give UNSCOP, the UN Special Committee on Palestine, a report about its own administration of Palestine, a kind of a report where they tried to say, we were trying to do the best thing. We tried to get the Jews and the Arabs together, but they could never come together. So the British government was putting the onus on the Arabs and Jews for not being able to be reasonable. The document made a claim, namely that the Treaty of Lausanne had entered into force. And this, of course, was based on Britain's fallacious reading of the Treaty of Lausanne. But in the 1947 document, the British government said that the Treaty of Lausanne had entered into legal force by the time of the action of the League Council in September of 1923, where the League Council had not actually said that the mandate was going to be in effect, but only that the fact that there was to be a condition of France's mandate with Syria, that condition was now met. But in any event, the 1947 document says that by the time of that action of the League Council in September of 23, which the British government is now taking as putting the mandate into effect. The 1947 document says that by that point in time, the Treaty of Lausanne had come into force, which meant that the Council of the League was using the Treaty of Lausanne and Britain's supposed territorial rights as a basis for saying that Britain had a mandate. In fact, the Treaty of Lausanne had not come into legal effect by September of 1923. The Treaty of Lausanne was concluded in July of 1923. It didn't get ratification until August of 24. So this statement by the British government in 1947 that the League Council was able to legalize the mandate because the Treaty of Lausanne was in effect, that was simply untrue. I mean, that can't be characterized as anything other than prevarication on the part of the British government. So that was part of what went to UNSCOP and had these, representatives, these fellows who were neophytes on the Palestine question, accepting whatever the British government was saying. They never figured out that the British government was lying to them on that point.
Yeah, but they're as guilty because honestly, it's the so-called UN is obviously extremely corrupt and run by the sort of top colonial powers, and they didn't want to upset the balance. It was their responsibility to really look into it. But also, I mean, from what I'm hearing, it's like Shamim writes novels. I mean, this is like the ultimate fiction. It's like lies upon lies and deceits to make a good novel, Shamim. But what the British did in Palestine to the Palestinians is a massive crime, as you've sort of discovered and uncovered. It all stacks up. And this kind of leads us from all your discoveries and all the deceits and the lies and the manipulations, which brings us to sort of September 25, when you, with my cousin Victor and Professor Avi Shleim, you filed the groundbreaking legal petition demanding accountability and a path to Palestinian justice. So I would love to hear, we discussed it with my cousin, but would love to hear your perspective about Britain Owes Palestine, the petition, what you're demanding, your key legal violations that you'd like addressed, because I know it's a 400 plus page document, and what, how did all that come about and what you're hoping to achieve?
The petition takes the position that Britain committed a legal wrong, actually a whole variety of legal wrongs against the people of Palestine, and that when a legal wrong is committed, there is an obligation for what is called reparation, which is a rather ambiguous term, but that some kind of redress is required. So the petition goes through everything that we've just been talking about to show that what was done was unlawful. The subtitle actually to my book about all this is legal chicanery on a world stage. But the petition goes through all that and then says that means that reparations are required, both for remaining in Palestine, controlling it in violation of the covenant of the League of Nations, then for all of the atrocities of the 1936 period, the uprising against Britain, and that redress is required. And it calls for financial compensation, and perhaps more importantly, calls on the British government to take action that would do what is within Britain's power to bring about a better circumstance for the people of Palestine. And it remains to be worked out exactly what that could be. But, such things as calling Palestine Action a terrorist group in London, one might say, well, that's inconsistent. That's a continuation of the wrongs that Britain committed before. So that at the very least, it should stop committing wrongs against the people of Palestine.
But what do you think meaningful accountability would look like in an ideal world from this?
Well, nothing is going to be ideal because the whole culture of the country was damaged in 1948 in ways that can't really be repaired, and then Britain, of course, has assisted Israel with regard to Gaza. And you can't repair all that in the sense of what in the law we call the status quo ante, of putting things in the situation that existed prior to the commission of the legal wrong. So one is required then to try to figure out, well, what can be done. And the petition talks about promoting a two-state solution, which is something that doesn't repair everything that was done by any means, but might be feasible under current circumstances. So it does get a bit squishy, I might say, if I could use a legal term, when you talk about what reparation would look like. But at the very least, it would require Britain in its actions in the UN to take positions favorable to the Palestinian situation, which Britain hasn't really done over the last period of time.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about solution in a minute, but first I would like to ask you, because your research proves that Israel's creation was based on legal fraud, and Britain had no authority to promise Palestine to anyone. At the time they even did the Balfour Declaration, it was still under Ottoman rule and not under Britain. So if the entire legal foundation was fraudulent from the start, what does that mean in terms of Israel's legitimacy today?
Well, in terms of what states exist, the question of legitimacy is not high on the list. That may be unfortunate, but states exist when they are accepted by the community of nations. So you do have the UN General Assembly in 1949 admitting Israel to membership in the United Nations. Now, membership in the United Nations isn't necessarily something that's valid for all time, but until something is done to retract, it does mean an acceptance of an entity as a state, and that entitles that entity to participate in the United Nations.
If I can push back a little bit, please, because when they did admit them, it was based on conditions. I think there were at least 5 conditions that were never met. So then that's null and void, because if you're accepted and admitted in the United Nations on very specific, clear terms that almost 80 years later haven't been met, then it doesn't entitle you just because you were admitted and no one followed through. You're the lawyer, so yeah.
Well, yeah, you're raising a point on which different lawyers have different opinions. So the fact that I'm a lawyer doesn't necessarily mean that my view on it is the accurate one. in order to be a member, you have to be peace-loving. That's a requirement, Article 4 of the UN Charter. When Israel put in its application for membership, the General Assembly did something quite unusual in regard to membership applications. Namely, it held hearings to decide whether Israel was a peace-loving state. Now, as I say, normally when a state applies to be a member, it just kind of goes through automatically, and they don't do this sort of thing. So that did indicate that the General Assembly had some questions about whether Israel qualified for membership, and namely whether it was peace-loving. And there were two issues that were prominent. One was the status of Jerusalem, and the other was the repatriation of those who had been forced out of Palestine, or forced into other parts of Palestine, which would, prominently Gaza. That proceeding was done in a committee called the Ad Hoc Political Committee of the General Assembly in the spring of 1949. And Abba Eban, who was the representative of Israel at the UN, spoke there on behalf of Israel and made the case that Israel was a peace-loving state. He was pressed very strongly on these two issues, on Jerusalem and on refugee repatriation, because some states were not prepared to vote Israel's membership until those issues could be resolved, or at least they could get some commitment from Israel on those issues. And Abba Eban, parried and danced around those issues. On the issue of repatriation, he said that's a domestic issue for Israel. It's not an international issue. So he basically said, we're not going to give you any satisfaction on that issue. Then on the issue of Jerusalem, he said, that Jerusalem was something that was under the jurisdiction of the UN, and that Israel would not make claims on Jerusalem. That is, mean any part of Jerusalem at that point. We're not talking about East and West Jerusalem, but any part. So he made a commitment on Jerusalem. Now, by the end of the year 1949, they were claiming Jerusalem, but that's that's in the future. But as of the time of the vote, Abba Eban had made this commitment with regard to Jerusalem, but had been, ambiguous on the refugees. But it's on the basis that he was questioned on these two issues, and that he had made a commitment with regard to Jerusalem, that you'll find lawyers who say that means that the admission of Israel was conditioned on Israel coming through favorably on those two issues. Therefore, that the act of admitting Israel became invalid because Israel did not carry through, well, either on Jerusalem or on the refugees.
Yeah, but I think it's a bit of a joke in that they said, "Oh, Israel is a peace-loving nation." I mean, if anyone bothered to look at the history, especially the UN, who gave Palestine or most of Palestine to the Zionists at the time, the massacres and the killings of the Palestinians were already in the 20s and the 30s, escalated in the 40s. They were documented by the UN. So all that was very much available had they bothered. So this whole loving question is, I think, a joke because they knew it was documented. And the story of Palestine or Jerusalem, again, that should have been, they had their conditions, and if you don't implement them and you're automatically granted membership and you failed, most people, if a student fails or commits a crime, they are punished for it and there's a consequence. So it's just like they wanted to continue with this colonial viewpoint of that and to shove it out of their book. And again, I'm not a lawyer, but it's just morally wrong, and I think legally wrong. It just doesn't stand if these were the conditions and they weren't met.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, the realpolitik of the situation was that both the Soviet Union and the United States were supporting the admission of Israel as a member, and there wasn't any real prospect of dislodging the Israeli forces from the sectors of Palestine that they were holding. So, I mean, you perhaps can analyze the act of admitting admitting Israel as a member in 1949 as a consequence of the weakness of the United Nations and
it's corruption, really.
The major powers to do what they want. Similar to the League of Nations, not taking
very much so
forthright position in the 20s.
Yeah, very much so. But for Palestinians, I mean, we're watching the Gaza genocide, whether we're Palestinians in the diaspora, whether we're Palestinians in Palestine, occupied Palestine, watching Gaza being destroyed, Gaza, watching the West Bank being annexed piece by piece by the settler colony of Israel, while they're choking the Palestinian existence into Bantustans. I mean, Shamim's family is Indian from South Africa, so they left because of apartheid. So for me, and for I think probably 8 million Palestinians in the diaspora, the two-state delusion is not really a solution. It's a delusion. Because they've shrunk a Palestinian existence into nothing. They control every aspect of Palestinian life. So really, what constitutes a state? What they've left behind is not a state. So I'd love to know. You said you're part of your government, if you like, submission is for a two-state. But personally, I believe in a one democratic decolonized state from the river to the sea with justice and freedom and equality for all. And that shouldn't be, and human dignity should not be such a big ask for Palestinians. And also reparations, it's not only financial reparations, but also complete land and resource restitution to all Palestinians and our right of return as guaranteed under international law. So all these issues are just keep on being pushed under the carpet, if you like. And I'd love to know, what does justice for Palestine under international law looks like? It's what we as Palestinians would like, but under international law, what does it look like?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's really very hard to say what would constitute justice. I mean, as I've said, there's no way of putting things back to 1920, and that's unfortunate. But Mr. Arafat used to talk about justice when he was asked the same question. He said, well, we want partial justice. I'm not sure.
Well, he doesn't speak for most Palestinians.
Well,
so whatever Oslo and other deals and things he did, it was for a very small percentage of Palestinians who have sold out. It was not speaking on behalf of, nobody came around and asked our opinion or vote on anything. Sorry, but go ahead, John.
Yes, no, your point taken. But I think his point is valid, that namely that there's no way to achieve real justice. And he had his ideas on what the partial justice should be. But No, I mean, whether it would be a single state in the entirety of the territory, or two states. If it's a single state, does that include repatriation? I think, you're suggesting it would have to include that. So, I mean, there's difficulty in achieving either of these solutions, either the two-state or the one state.
Well, the Germans are still paying 80 years later. They're still paying reparations to Israel. It's not about the payment. It's about justice, and it's about dignity. It's like saying in the States where you are, oh, if you're Jewish, you can vote, or you can go on this road, or you can live here. But if you're Christian or Muslim, you can't, or vice versa. It's just an apartheid, ethno-supremacist regime. And, and it calls itself a democracy, which it's not. A democracy is when you have full equality for all citizens under the law. So, shoving off a two-state delusion on Palestinians, it's like a Band-Aid. It'll erupt. Nobody will accept it. They might buy themselves a bit of time, but it's just not a solution. So, yeah.
Yes, yeah. So, I mean, that's the solution in the petition. But I think that's the least significant aspect of the petition. I mean, what is important about the petition is what it says about Britain's responsibility, but how that will be worked out and what could be done for there to be effective reparations. That's very complicated. But the important point is that something has to be done, that the British government can't simply go along as it has been for decades, 1947 lying to the UN to justify what it had done in Palestine, and then accepting what the major powers in the Security Council have said without stepping forward and saying, no, we made a mess of this, and we need to come up with some real solutions.
Yeah. So the other question I wanted to ask you is, you've put in the petition, Britain knows Palestine. What can people do, if anything, specifically regarding this, to add pressure to the UK government and to help the cause?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it would be important, and this hasn't quite been done yet, that a kind of citizen movement be generated around the petition. And in that sense, perhaps, as from what we've just been saying, it's a bit complicated because the petition does talk about two states. But I hopefully people would accept the proposition that that's not the real essence of the petition. But that there should be a major citizen movement, that is that different Palestinian organizations would begin to put pressure on Britain. I mean, they don't have to accept everything about the petition, but the concept that Britain has a special debt to Palestine is something that I think one will not find objections to in the Palestinian community.
No, I agree. I think it's a very, very important petition, and that's the least the British can do is to own up and to do something. But I think you'll find a lot more support from Palestinians in the diaspora, and I'm sure in under occupation, if the aim is a one state and not a two states, which most Palestinians view as a sellout. It was a sellout by previous leadership. It's still a sellout for those who still advocated from the diaspora, and a lot of Palestinians I know who live there as well. But I wanted to ask you a final, I really appreciate that the work you're doing, and And I wanted to ask you sort of a final question. So you've spent 4 decades talking about how Palestinians were erased through manipulation, bureaucratic manipulation, how lies became truths, how legal fraud became international policy. So how would you like people to remember you from your life's work? And is there something today that we haven't covered that you'd like to share with our audience? Big question.
Not sure how to answer. I suppose I would like to be remembered as somebody that went to evidence and didn't accept what others were saying about situations, and that lesson would be carried through in work that is done by historians and by legal historians. So I consider myself a legal historian. And if I can make a pitch for lawyers, I think lawyers do have a leg up on other historians in writing about history, because we are used to dealing with documents. You can't go into court and just say what you think. You have to have some basis for it. So I think that's what lawyers can bring to the analysis of history relating to Palestine or more generally.
Fantastic. Professor Quigley, we will put the links in our bio here for people who'd like to follow your work, including your book, Britain and its Mandate over Palestine, Legal Chicanery on a World Stage. I love that title. In the meantime, it just remains me to thank you and to say to our viewers that history will judge all of us by how we respond and the actions we take to stop the ongoing erasure and ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, this intentional Israeli man-made starvation, and this barbaric ongoing, unfortunately, despite talk of ceasefire, live-streamed Gaza genocide. It is our responsibility to speak out and to act against injustice. So if you've enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Professor Quigley, thank you again for your courage in uncovering all of this information and your decades of research and documentation and your commitment and clarity to this cause. Thank you.
And I just want to add, thank you also for digging deeper behind the scenes and uncovering so much material that will uncover and will stay on for generations to come. So I think that's a very big legacy to leave, even though we don't agree on a two-state solution, but what your work has been very, very important. So thank you for that. And as I wrap, stories and representation matter. Stay informed, stay engaged, speak up, and most importantly, take action for justice for Palestine. Our collective voice is making a change. In solidarity and with appreciation. See you next time. And thank you again, and shukran for being here today.